Have you ever found yourself wondering, how did I get here? The year is 2019, and my wife and I were living in Oregon. In January of that year, we welcomed our first child into the world, Amelia. And as first-time parents, we were freaking out. We had no idea what we were doing, but we started to figure it out just a little bit. That same year, we decided to buy our first home. We started saving the year prior, knowing that we wanted to own a home, and we knew that we couldn't spend as much money as we were eating out and Starbucks, and we were in Oregon, that's like a coffee paradise, and so we bought our first home. That year as well, my role at that church in Oregon changed and shifted. I was the middle school pastor, the church running about 2,000, and I went from being the middle school pastor to overseeing all of student ministry and discipleship, which is around 300 teens, and so it was a big step. So as we're moving into our house, I get a call from our senior pastor letting us know that he is resigning. And so we go, it's okay. We're going to be just fine. And as the summer progressed, I took on more leadership and more roles. I started preaching more because we had a huge vacuum in our preaching team at the church. Part of my stepping into the role that I was new in was I was going to be able to have an admin and some support roles, but that didn't get to happen in the transition. It was about September of that year. We had just launched all of our ministries, and I was outside cooking and grilling. My sister-in-law was in town, and as I'm grilling, I have these big steaks and colorful veggies on the grill. I bring them inside, we pray, we sit down, I cut into it, and the inside is as red can be. I go out to the grill and I kick it over. I start yelling. I start cussing. I'm mad. My wife comes out and says, "Whoa, what's up? What's going on?" And to find out, I was stressed out. I was incredibly burnt out, and I didn't know how I got here. How did we get here? Maybe you were going off to college, and you started out in your studies doing very, very well, but then you met friends, and you want to be a good student, but you want to have a social life, so you started to lean into the social life just a little bit more. And the next thing you know, you get to your spring semester, your GPA is not where it needs to be, and now you have to explain to your parents why you're looking for a different school. Maybe you just have not been feeling good, but the pressures of life are too much. You can't get to the doctor. You have kids, a job, a spouse. There's so many things going on, so you just do. You make do and you push through. But it gets to the point where it's so much that you have to go in, and now it's too far gone. Your diagnosis, what you have, has progressed. How did I get here? Maybe you were star-crossed lovers, and you were so in love with your spouse, but as time goes on, the distance between you goes on, and you start to draft up papers of divorce, and the question is, how did I get here? You plan for one thing, you accept for that thing to happen, but in the midst of living, something else presents itself. This leads us to the story today in the book of Exodus, a book that is loved by so many people, that have given life to so many people. Generations upon generations have loved this book. But the opening chapters of this is simply, how did we get here type of story. The end of Genesis ends in shalom. Joseph is reunited with his brothers that sold him into slavery. And while he's there, he is thrown into slavery in jail, but yet he is moved to the right hand of the Pharaoh. He ends up saving all of Egypt because a famine comes. He brings his family there, and they're thriving. So much that the Pharaoh of the time, when Joseph's dad dies, goes back to his home with him to help embalm and to bury him. Good things happen at the end of Genesis. There is shalom, there is peace, people are saved. And as the opening book of Exodus starts, there's flourishing, there's numbers, beautiful things are happening, but then it changes. How did we get here? And we pick up the story in Exodus 1, Exodus 1, verses 8 through 14. And it says this. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal with them shrewdly, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and they will leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. A tyrant is now in charge, and he turns the blessing of God's people into a curse. Joseph saved all of Egypt. Through Abraham, all people were to be blessed. This is a part of God's covenant, part of God's promise, and they're flourishing. It's because of these people, these sojourners in this space, that Egypt was saved. But instead of the presence of them and their flourishing being seen as a blessing, it was seen as a burden. It was seen as a threat. And this Pharaoh says that he did not know them. This is not simply forgetting a distant relative's birthday, or you're going to leave your car and you accidentally lock your keys in your car. The no here is intentional. It's on purpose. This Pharaoh knows truly well what the Israelite people have done in this space, but this Pharaoh does not care. There's a scheme at play. There's a ruse. There's a desire that he has in his heart, and he puts it into practice. This Pharaoh wants power. This Pharaoh is an agent of chaos, wanting to undo God's creation and undo God's people. And what does he do? He strikes fear and he uses fear. You know, there are a lot more of them than there are of us. You know, we were the dominant culture, but they're just all over the place. Maybe we won't be the dominant culture anymore. You know, they're having way more kids than us. You know, if they were to join our enemy, then we would be in trouble. We wouldn't be able to do this. They may overcome us. Strikes fear and uses fear. And in order to control, what does Pharaoh do? He oppresses them. Slavery, hate, brutal treatment. Work them to death so that they won't multiply. Yet they continue to increase. God continues to bless them with numbers. But yet as their workload increased, so did the hate around them. And so did the brutal treatment. The words used in this section are this: oppression, forced labor, worked them ruthlessly, made their lives bitter. The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And it seems that the smear campaign is working. Let's continue on in our story. The king of Egypt said to Hebrew midwives, whose name were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that it's a baby boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why are you letting these boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Well, Hebrew women are not like, Egyptian women. They're vigorous. They give birth way before we could even get there." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. But then Pharaoh orders this to all people, not just to Egyptians, to all people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. A source of life, water, turned into a source of death. Pharaoh used his power to ask the midwives to do his dirty work, but they didn't, and the people continued to thrive and flourish. So one of the worst acts in all of Scripture happens: genocide. Anyone can take a Hebrew baby and dispose. Hate leads to genocide. Hate never leads to the flourishing of life. You know, when I read this story, it begs the question of how far removed are we from the history in these pages, from the acts that are happening? Not too far in our history, there is hate, there is slavery, there is times of oppression, there is genocide of minorities in our history. Next week in our services, we get to talk about Father's Day, but we also get to talk about Juneteenth. And that echoes of lynchings that we hear in the South, redlining in organizations and neighborhoods that kept people of color from living amongst those that weren't people of color. We have the stories of the civil rights movement. We live in a very polarized day, don't we? That the tactics of fear are used again and again. Fear sells and half-truths are so much more compelling. We don't want to give you the facts. We want to tell you a story. We want to tell you a story so that you will believe a story. And it all starts with fear. Fear of the unknown. Now, the book of Exodus is a highly political book, so we can't help but talk about politics for just very brief second. We have a leader who's losing touch with history, who refuses to recognize what minority Israel has done, and instead of seeing them as a blessing, chooses to see them as a problem and chooses to eradicate them. It is a reminder that hate is never a good thing. And I believe as a church, we can't afford not to be political. The very statement, Jesus Christ is Lord, is a deeply political statement. It is deeply political, but guess what? It is not a partisan statement. It is a reminder that we live by a different kingdom, that our allegiance is to a different king, that we live our lives and hold our lives in such a different way that we follow King Jesus instead. When other people cling to political parties and say, this is the way to go, this is where Jesus is, we take a step back and we say, no. We follow someone else. We follow the one that says, turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Pray for your enemies. You've heard said eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but Jesus says, no, I don't allow that. Don't fight back. Don't hurt. Don't harm. But fear, man, it sells, doesn't it? I've been a part of 3 elections now, voted in 2012, 2016, 2020. And I remember very vividly watching on all news stations that saying, if this party wins, we will all die. If this party wins, we will all die. Hi, we're still here. As this gets pushed, the divide that we see in our church grows more and more as we have people who choose the elephant or the donkey over being people of the cross. We have given ourselves over the tactics of Pharaoh. And what are those tactics? And we see them in our lives and in the church. Lying, demonizing, spreading false information, choosing to hate, choosing to hurt, choosing to smear others. And as I read this text and as we start this journey in the book of Exodus, it's so hard not to see the correlations happening in our lives today. Fear is not from Jesus. It corrupts, it hurts, and it puts people against one another. The Apostle Paul said it perfectly in Ephesians chapter 6, where he says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood," period. What he means here is this: people are not your enemy. Instead of disagreeing with ideas or arguing ideas, we harm people. And then those who aren't like us, think like us, look like us, or vote like us become our enemy. And we're all sucked into the grand drama of placing brother against brother, sister against sister, and neighbor against neighbor. Again, the text asks this question: how did we get here? And this is the trouble that the text brings to light. Are we the liberators in this story bringing shalom to people? Or are we the Egyptians making life hell? And as we get back to the text, it's hard not to read this text and ask a very important question. God, where are you? What are you up to? Why is this happening? Where are you in the midst of this? Because when we think of the book of Exodus, we think of the Red Sea. We think of the plagues. We think of a cloud by day and a fire by night. We think of these grandiose moments. But so far, God's covenant people are being hurt, enslaved, scapegoated. And there's all kinds of things happening. I kind of wonder if a better question might be this. When our sufferings are overwhelming, how can we still see God? We all experience suffering in one way or another. In the midst of those deep sorrows, how on earth is it possible to see God? Through the pain and tears in our eyes, how do we see God? I want to look at two spots because God is at work and God is doing something. In Exodus 1:15 through 17, it says this. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, those names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby boy if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. And then also in verse 22, let the girls live. Verse 22, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. In the face of a tyrant, it is two barren Hebrew midwives, slaves on the lowest of the pyramid of social status, who resist a tyrant. And it says that they feared God. Now, fear of God is not fear of living that God is just going to be like, don't like you, gone. That's not what fear of God means. But instead, it's that their life, their livelihood is wrapped up in who God is that they served. A deep orientation of life, knowing that their being was held up in God. And in the face of a tyrant, their lives on the line, guess what they say? No. They say no. And they even appeal to Pharaoh's prejudice. They make up a story about Hebrew women. You know, they just give birth really fast. We get there and it's like, boop, baby. Like, that's not how that works. Come on now, Pharaoh. There's something going on in this text. Pharaoh hates these people. And so as the midwives are describing them as somewhat less than, Pharaoh's like, yeah, that makes sense. They're terrible. They're dogs. They're animals. They're vermin. Pharaoh accepts it because he hates them. And this caused me pause. And God's Spirit asked me this question. What prejudices are you holding on to? When there are people not like you, and you hear stories, and you hear things about others, are you quick to just accept because there's something deep in that you need to confess? Or do you give people the benefit of the doubt? Do you see the image of God in all people, or are you quick to assume? That wasn't a fun conversation. But the question is asked, what prejudices are we still holding on to? The text asks hard questions about our hearts, but because of the midwives' faithfulness, God blessed them and gave them families of their own. Pharaoh overlooked the women in this story, but the women have a huge part to play, and they do something about it. The story continues on, and Moses is born. The baby boys are in trouble. Anyone now can just kill them. Moses is hidden for a few months by his mother until she is unable to hide him any longer. In a desperation, an act of love, an act of courage, maybe even some diligence in planning, she puts Moses in a basket. Not just a basket, but an ark. The same Hebrew word used for Noah's boat is the basket. This is a place of salvation. From afar, his sister watches him. At any time, someone could just simply lean over, see the baby, and just tip over the basket and follow through with the mandate from Pharaoh. As he floats down, he floats into the waters of Pharaoh's own daughter. She has compassion on the Hebrew baby, circumcised, and calls him his own. From afar, the sister comes in and approaches and asks if she needs help. A nurse, because guess what? She knows someone. She gets Moses' own mother and Moses gets paid. His mother gets paid to raise her own child, who is now in safety, who will one day be the mouthpiece of salvation for all the people there. An act of courage in defiance towards a tyrant. The love of a mother hiding Moses for as long as she can. The diligence of a sister staying by. And the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter, someone of privilege, someone from the other side who does the right thing. So where is God at work in this text? God is at work in the blood-stained hands of the midwives that are choosing to bring life into the world instead of kill life. God is at work in a mom who's hoping and praying as she's breastfeeding, saying, please be quiet, please be quiet. They might hear you. God is at work in those stories. God is at work in a sister who goes above and beyond to know what's going on with her mother, knowing what's going on with her brother, and wants to save him. And God is at work in someone who's on the wrong side of history, but chooses compassion, chooses to do the right thing. This is where God is at work. It's through the small acts of kindness and courage and love that turns the tide of the world to the way it should be. And it's through those acts where God is at work, creating beauty from often chaos. And we are called to live our lives in such a way that when God pours his love in us, it pours out towards others. That we work and we move towards life, towards unity, where we are curious about other people, where we choose not to demonize, hurt, or to push people away. I love this quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's dense, but let's get through it together. There are three possible ways in which the church can act towards the state, a nation, a country. The first place, as it has always been, it can ask the state whether its actions are legitimate in accordance with the character of the state. It can throw the state back on its responsibilities. Are you truly doing what is right? Are you truly doing and being the nation you are supposed to be? Second, it aids the victims within state. We ask, are you doing the right thing? And then we see people being harmed, and we get to be the ones that get to do something about those being harmed. The church has an unconditional obligation to victims of any society, even if they don't belong to Christian community. Do good to all people. In both of these courses of action, the church serves the free state in its free way. And at times when laws are changed, the church may in no way withdraw from these tasks. And the third possibility is not just to bandage the victims under the wheel, but to jam a spoke into the wheel of injustice itself. What Dietrich is saying here is our first task is to be a voice of love in the midst of such tremendous hate. That's the task of the church. We are an alternative community created around love where we all have so many differences of opinion, but we are united in Christ and we come together and we partake of communion with one another and say, Jesus Christ is Lord. Everything else is secondary. We also care for victims. And this is the church at its best. We want to live our lives in such a way that if our church were to be removed from this space, our community would mourn because of what we bring to our neighbors, to our friends, to those that need Jesus and those that just need a friend, a home. They're dealing with loneliness or homelessness, whatever it may be. We want to live our lives in such a way that God is doing radical, beautiful things here in us and through us. And our neighbors go, we need you. There's a lot of chaos in our world, right? We go to think about doing something, and sometimes it's overwhelming. Where do I start? Where do I begin? Because I have chaos even in my own life, and I don't know what to do. It can be overwhelming not knowing what to do or where to go. But what God asks us to do is use all that we have to do what we can, to do something. You don't have to do everything, but we are called to do something. There's a beautiful arc about Egypt, and there's a beautiful arc about our lives. In times in our lives, we probably have identified as Egypt, where we have harmed others. Maybe not at the scale of what we are reading, but in how we've interacted, how we've shunned people that are different than us, or how we disagree. But there's a redemptive arc. Egypt is oppressor. But in the book of Matthew, they're protector. It's flipped. Herod is this power-hungry king wanting to kill the Christ child. And through a dream in the middle of the night, Mary and Joseph flee to guess where? They flee to Egypt. What a beautiful, beautiful narrative arc of grace, of redemption. And what that tells me is no one is too far gone. God's grace can reach in any depth. The stain of sin goes deep, but God's grace goes so much deeper. We can go from oppressor to protector. So my questions for us as we close are these. Where have I wronged others? Where have I bought into the lies, and where do I have prejudice? And then a deep question as we approach the table here soon is, where have I sinned? God is gracious. God loves us deeply. And as we wrestle in community about what is happening in our world, there is grace upon grace upon grace, knowing that each and every one of us will not get this right perfectly. And we'll have to come again and again and again and say, I messed up. I screwed up. And there's so much power in simply just saying, I don't know, but I'm interested in learning. The church collective has been called to a high calling. We are to be liberated, brought to God, so in return we can bring others to God. It is the church and through our action that God's Spirit works to bandage up the pain of those that they're experiencing. Where is God at work? God is at work in every person who decides that no matter what they have to offer, no matter how big or small, they'll do something. Because God uses every act of mercy, love, and courage. And those acts echo into eternity, into the world that is to come.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran, and our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.